If it's Thursday, the gloves are off. Former President Trump attacks Vice President Kamala Harris as a, quote, radical left lunatic on the campaign trail, as the de facto Democratic nominee tries to frame the race against Trump as a battle over freedom. Plus, the first installment of our NBC Focus Group series since President Biden dropped out of the race and backed VP Harris, and since Trump survived an assassination attempt, reveals new insights into what key voters are thinking after a truly unprecedented series of events. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to meet with Vice President Harris at the White House minutes from now, after meeting with President Biden and the families of Americans still being held by Hamas in a first-of-its-kind joint meeting. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake. One passed torch, one new candidate, two shifts in tone. That's the state of play in an unprecedented 2024 campaign that now has just 103 days to go till Election Day. As President Biden lays out his vision for the remainder of his term in office, with former President Trump and Vice President Harris sharpening their attacks on each other. Last night, President Biden publicly addressed his decision to leave the race in a solemn and emotional Oval Office address, with his family watching in the wings. The president leaned into what had been a major theme of his campaign, threats to democracy, while also highlighting the need for new and younger voices in charge.
Nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation.
It comes as his chosen successor, Vice President Harris, appears to be leaning into a slightly different message as she reintroduces herself to American voters. Today, her campaign is out with its first video warning of threats to Americans' freedom rather than democracy, backed by the Beyoncé track of the same name. Speaking to the American Federation of Teachers in Houston today, they're the first union to endorse her, the vice president tested out that new message.
In this moment, we are in a fight for our most fundamental freedoms. And to this room of leaders, I say, bring it on. We who believe in the freedom to vote will pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. We who believe in the freedom to live safe from gun violence will pass an assault weapons ban. And we who believe in reproductive freedom will restore the freedom of a woman to make decisions about her own body.
Meanwhile, former President Trump also shifting his messaging in his first rally since Harris became the Democratic Party's de facto nominee, tying her to the Biden administration's record and painting her as more extreme than his former opponent.
For 3.5 years, Lion Kamala Harris has been the ultra-liberal driving force behind every single Biden catastrophe. She is a radical left lunatic who will destroy our country. They say something happened to me when I got shot. I became nice. And when you're dealing with these people, they're very dangerous people. When you're dealing with them, you can't be too nice. You really can't be. So if you don't mind, I'm not going to be nice. Is that okay? He's worse than him because he's a fake liberal. You know, he wasn't that liberal. He was fake. She's a real liberal. She really is a real liberal. She's much worse than him.
And joining me now on set is NBC's Yamiche Alcindor, who's been following the Harris campaign. Kelly O'Donnell is at the White House for us, and senior national politics reporter Matt Dixon has the latest on all things with the Trump campaign. So, Yamiche, we mentioned the Harris campaign introducing this freedom video. Is this a total overhaul of the Biden message of protecting democracy, or is this kind of the same concept in new clothes?
I think this is President Biden's message with Beyoncé added to it. I think this is an addition. This is sort of a modernization and a fresh look at what he's already been telling the American people, which is that they believe Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. And I was looking at what she said in this ad, and I think it bears repeating in some ways, because she says there are people that want us to be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate, but we choose something different. We choose freedom. And she talks about the fact that there's gun violence that needs to be talked about, and abortion and healthcare. So if you think about a threat to democracy as not just sort of election integrity and election fraud, but she's saying holistically, a working democracy means people have control over their body and their lives, and that also means a sort of real bite at the American dream. So I think this is her really trying to lean in on that message, but also sort of bringing people in and making it modern.
Freedom to send your kids to school without worrying about them getting shot is an important kind of freedom, too, I think the argument would go. Sounds like a pretty warm reception there from that AFT group here. How important is union support going to be for the vice president? I mean, it was such a cornerstone of the Biden coalition.
Yeah, well, think about what position she's in. She has to make up for lost ground, and she has to get the coalition together, and they do not have the luxury to wait. So she's going to really be leaning in on all sorts of groups, including, of course, unions. I was listening to her speech. She talked about the fact that unions were really, she thought really important to building the middle class of America. She said when unions are great, America is great. She also talked about teachers and is, talking about gun violence. She said Republicans want to ban books. We want to ban assault rifles. So really talking about the fact that these unions are really the heart of sort of civil rights issues that Democrats want to point at. So I think that unions are going to really be important, but you're also going to see her in Atlanta, Georgia next week, where you're going to see her talking to African-American voters, African-American men in particular, and also just other coalitions that they're going to have to bring together that really pull this home if they're going to win.
She has made the point to thank President Biden, to talk up President Biden at the opening of basically all of her remarks since she stepped more into the spotlight. Do you expect that to change over time, especially if the Trump campaign is going to try to use her and tying her and Biden together as a negative against her?
I don't think that that's going to change. And here's why, Garrett. She is vice president because President Biden chose her. From my understanding and talking to people close to her, she has a real respect for him. She has a real respect for the hard position that he was in, and this really unprecedented, we've used that word, but it really was a move that none of us saw, that was not on any of our bingo cards, that he was going to step down. So she, from talking to people closer, really feels very much like she wants to also be part of his legacy and wants people to know that this was about sort of his decision. She wasn't sort of undermining him. In the last few weeks, she wasn't sort of speaking to people quietly saying, well, I hope he gets out. All my sources said she was really saying, it's going to be your decision. I'm going to be at the top or the ticket, or I'm going to be your running mate. Whatever you decide is what you decide. So I think we're going to continue to hear that. But she's also going to say, I earned this nomination. She spent hours and hours talking to people on Sunday, Democratic leaders, delegates that had to vote for her. So she's really going to also lean in on the idea that while Trump is saying that I'm not really the nominee and I'm DEI and all of that stuff, here are the people that I talked to in my party that made sure that I was officially the nominee and this wasn't just a coronation.
And you mentioned the Atlanta trip next week. Do you have a sense of how much we are still seeing sort of a parallel campaign? Like, would she have been in Atlanta next week if she was still the vice president backing up Joe Biden? Have we kind of jumped to tracks now where she's the nominee, she's making the decisions about where she goes? Or her, is this the Harris campaign, or is this still, we're kind of riding the Biden train while we figure out exactly what we're doing going forward?
Well, if you ask somebody in the Harris campaign what their email address right now, it says @joebiden.com, right? So this is definitely a plane that is being built in midair. But that being said, this is a new event that is coming together. I've been talking to people. Where is it? What time is it? All the things that reporters like us want to know. They have no information right now. And that's because that's a new idea. So I think it's important that they are sort of leaning in and building something new. And I think Georgia really shows that that's something, even though I will say for the last few weeks, I've been hearing people say Georgia and North Carolina were really important. So it's not surprising that Georgia would be there already.
It's fascinating to watch this happen. And we've been doing this a long time. You and I, we're seeing stuff we haven't seen before. Yamiche El-Senor, thank you for your reporting. And Kelly, speaking of things we're not used to really seeing, take us inside the White House last night for the kind of before and after of the president's remarks. Obviously, we saw the photos of his family by his side. We saw the White House staff there. What was that night like last night? What's it like at the White House today?
A lot of emotions, and certainly those ran the gamut from a sense of sadness, even a bit of mournfulness, as one official described it to me, about the president taking himself out of this race and having to express that publicly. A solemnity to it as well. We don't typically see the family inside the Oval Office during an address. Those are usually very official moments on very major national events. This, of course, is a major national event, but it's so infused with the personal. So for the family, I think you saw glimpses of how this was a painful time. And then also when the president finished his remarks to the nation, stepping into the Rose Garden to the cheers of his staff members, to a sense of celebration for what he has accomplished and what is still to be done. So definitely a different kind of feeling. They all know that this has the weight of history on it, that a president to choose to be one term is rare. And for him to, at one point, having talked about being a transitional figure and then not wanting to get out of the race for a period of time, and we saw that resistance, and then to come to this place where he has made the decision, where he believes it is the right call. And they talked about pride, many of the officials that I talked to, pride in what his decision means, the opportunity it presents, and the fact that he put country before himself. So those are some of the emotions. They are not the typical day at the White House where people see such a personal sense of emotion coming forward, and we definitely got a sense of that. And now part of it will be kind of laying out what can be done for all of the people who work for the president. He gave them an end date as well. That is always true when there's an election coming, but in this case now they realize, okay, these White House jobs that they value have a limited shelf life now. If Kamala Harris is to win, perhaps some of them would continue on, but chances are they're all now seeing what the runway is left for them to accomplish work in their various areas. So planning for these remaining months, trying to make the best of it. We don't have a clear picture yet. They said they have talked about internally, the conversations are happening about what sort of trips might he want to do, what sort of agenda items can he put forward. So still a lot of things to figure out that we'll be following over the days to come.
All right, Kelly, hang tight. We have more to talk about the president's official duties in a minute, but I want to stay on the campaign for the moment and bring in Matt Dixon. So, Matt, Trump last night presented this no more Mr. Nice Guy move as a shift, but the unity message that his campaign had talked up was basically dead by about 30 minutes into his RNC speech. Even if Joe Biden had stayed in this race, do you think we would end up basically right back where we are with Trump in attack mode?
Well, you had talked about the unprecedented nature of this campaign, which is very true. But what is very, very precedented is sort of every time there's a unity or a reset message that Trump is going to soften his message and become a unifier, the media and others kind of take the bait and we start writing our stories about unity. And then inevitably all of that kind of goes up in smoke very quickly. And this is another example of that. We asked about the unity stuff a lot in Milwaukee. I and many others were in Milwaukee for the entire week for the RNC convention, asking this idea to delegates like, hey, is there going to be unity? Is there actually going to be a change? The campaign is actually talking about this time. And I thought one quote was really instructive from the Iowa GOP chairman. He said, I think it means every single registered Republican needs to vote for President Trump. And we got a lot of quotes like that from a lot of delegates. We did a story and there was a whole bunch of them who sort of framed it that way. The idea of unity is unifying behind Trump, not necessarily a bipartisan bring the country together. And I think that's what unity means for President Trump and a lot of Republicans. And that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think that's an astute read. I'm curious what you think, Matt. It seemed to me watching that rally last night that Donald Trump seems to be trying to recycle some of his attacks on Joe Biden by just tying Kamala Harris to his record. Is that Trump can't let Biden go, or is there real strategic value here in continuing to hammer Joe Biden and sort of bringing Kamala Harris along for the ride?
I mean, I think they see strategic value in it for a couple of reasons. Well, the big one being that it was working. I mean, I think there's a change at the top of the ticket for Democrats because they felt Joe Biden wasn't going to be able to win. He was doing poorly in both national and swing state polling. So some of the attack lines on Joe Biden were proving to be very effective. Now there's a new candidate with much more energy and, you know, getting a big fundraising and messaging boost here out of the gate. But I think there's still some sense on the Trump side that some of the same messaging worked. I do think that they are starting to talk to sort of test drive a new line about how Joe Biden acted like a California liberal. Kamala Harris is a California liberal. So I think they're going to start to evolve some of that messaging to focus more on Harris than some of the Biden stuff. But I think without question, some of the Biden messaging that we have seen throughout this campaign cycle is going to remain because, you know, she was, a co-pilot and the VP for all of it.
Yeah, and as Yamiche indicated, she's not going to distance herself from the Biden record. Matt, thank you for that reporting. I want to turn now back to the White House. And after delivering a fiery and defiant speech to Congress yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is there at the White House right now, where we're told he's meeting separately with President Biden and then with Vice President Harris. And while those meetings are going on inside, protesters are gathered outside the White House today. That follows the massive demonstrations seen around Capitol Hill yesterday, with many protesters calling Netanyahu a war criminal. Those protests escalated later in the day, with demonstrators seen burning American flags and the words "Hamas is coming" graffitied on a memorial outside Union Station. It is against that backdrop that Biden and Netanyahu met in the Oval Office today, where they touted their decades-long relationship. The two leaders are also meeting jointly today with families of the American hostages being held in Gaza. That meeting just wrapped up moments ago. And again, later this hour, Netanyahu is scheduled to meet with Vice President Harris before flying down to Mar-a-Lago, where he'll meet with former President Trump tomorrow. We'll bring back in Kelly O'Donnell to talk about all of these meetings. So, Kelly, Netanyahu has wanted a White House Oval Office meeting for some time now. But how is his speech yesterday on Capitol Hill being received by the Biden administration? It was not warmly received by a lot of Democrats yesterday on the Hill.
Well, the White House is declining to take it piece by piece, to not parse through the statement made in front of Congress, which, of course, did have some fiery rhetoric from Netanyahu. They do say that there are shared goals, certainly, and they believe that this can be a meaningful meeting. And when you point out wanting the White House meeting, they had met at the United Nations when the General Assembly was held, of course, and having an Oval Office meeting is one of the highest forms of diplomacy. No question, there have been many phone calls and video conferences between the president, some of them including Vice President Harris and Netanyahu, over recent months, considering all the different elements of the war that has been going on. But this is an opportunity, and what the president did not do is use that time in the Oval Office to say much publicly, saying they'd have a substantial meeting to come, and sort of opening the floor to Benjamin Netanyahu, who used that moment to talk about his long relationship with the president and the fact that Joe Biden, through the many years, has known every Israeli prime minister going back to Golda Meir. So kind of a moment of paying respects to the public service of Joe Biden, not so much the public discussion of the issues before them.
And Kelly, this separate meeting with the vice president today is kind of unusual, obviously, as she's starting campaign mode. What do you expect the tone of that meeting to be like? Is there a good cop, bad cop element to this?
Well, actually, these sorts of meetings are not that unusual. They just typically haven't gotten a lot of attention. When there is a head of state or a head of government that comes to the United States, often the president will have a meeting and then the vice president will have a separate meeting. In this case, because she was traveling today, had her event earlier, she's coming back, and scheduling-wise, they're having it separate. So that is part of what it's actually an interesting thing that you raise, because many people may not realize that those meetings happen. They just don't typically get attention when a vice president is doing it. She's now a vice president who is the candidate. So it has taken on much greater significance. She, through her time as vice president, has been a bit of the tip of the spear at times when she has talked about concern for a ceasefire, using some language that some people interpreted as being a bit further ahead of President Biden at the time. So that makes what she has to say with Benjamin Netanyahu very important, and people will be looking for the tone that she uses. Officials say there is no daylight between their positions, but sometimes it really is about a different personality being involved, a different kind of relationship that doesn't have the decades of backstory that Biden and Netanyahu have. So that's part of what we'll be looking for as this unfolds.
We should get a peek into that meeting later in the hour. Kelly O'Donnell, thank you for that reporting. And as we follow developing news from inside the White House this hour, we're hoping to bring you an interview with hostage family members as soon as they leave that closed-door meeting with President Biden and the Israeli Prime Minister. But first, the deciders facing a new decision. The newest installment of our focus group series with key 2024 voters and what a revamped Democratic ticket could mean, specifically for Trump skeptic primary voters who backed Nikki Haley. That's next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Vice President Harris's campaign has clearly energized Democrats. But what about those voters outside of the party's base, specifically the voters who are skeptical of former President Trump? They are the voters who could decide a close election in November. Our latest NBC News Deciders Focus Group, produced in collaboration with Engagious, Syracuse University and Sago, we talked to some of these voters. This is a group of Republicans who backed Nikki Haley in the Republican primary. We spoke with them on Tuesday night, just 2 days after President Biden stepped aside and endorsed Harris as his successor. Here's some of what they said when asked about the new de facto Democratic nominee.
Vice President Harris. First word or phrase that comes to mind. Everybody have one? Great. Barbara, please go first.
Interesting.
Jennifer.
Condescending.
Ronnie.
Flaky or word salad.
Dale.
Radical.
Melody.
I want to say intelligent.
Intelligent is the word?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, got it. Just make sure. Tiara?
Loyal. I would say a feminist.
June?
Sometimes catty.
Audra?
Giggly.
All right. Chris?
Coattails.
You said coattails, right?
Yeah.
All right. John?
Liberal.
Jason?
Word salad.
Just by a quick show of fingers. I noted Audra and Teresa that you have your fingers up. Among the 7 of you, how many of you feel like you don't have enough of an opinion about Vice President Harris to render an opinion one way or the other? Wow, nearly all of you.
All right, NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray joins me now. I mean, this is fascinating stuff. What do those answers tell you about Kamala Harris's opportunity to win over some of these voters she might very well need?
Yeah, Garrett, so some of them are positive for Harris, and those were people who we kind of found out later, they voted for Joe Biden in 2020. They were probably going to vote for him in 2024. They've kind of been consistent Democratic, or in at least the presidential election. Some of those descriptions you ended up hearing were absolutely harsh. And those are people who seem to be leaning Trump's way or might be voting third party. But to me, what was fascinating, I'm really glad you played the clip of the people. Raise your hands if you want to hear more, because the question that came after this, like, is there anything you dislike about Harris? And one respondent ended up saying, I want to know more about her. And that's what prompted the question, who wants to actually hear more? Everyone raised their hand. And so that is Harris's biggest challenge over the next 3.5 months. Can she actually describe to people who she is, what she, we're going to probably start hearing that from the convention, but boy, we don't have a lot of time between now and November.
But I will say, introducing yourself to people seems easier to me than having to change dead set opinions that might be more negative. I suppose that's a problem you could welcome if you're the Harris campaign. Age was such a big issue in the old matchup between these two candidates here. I want to play a little bit of what these Haley voters said about age now that President Biden is out of the race. Listen to this.
So let's talk about the age issue for a moment. Now that Biden is out of the race, is it persuasive for Democrats to argue that Trump, at the age of 78, would be the oldest person ever inaugurated if he won? That his age is a legitimate concern, and that it's time for a new generation of leaders to take over. Show of fingers. Who thinks this is a persuasive argument?
Can I put up half a finger?
I want to.
If there's components that I agree with, but other components I'm like, no, that's hogwash.
Wait, hold on a second. Audra, tell me very quickly in the interest of time, what part do you agree with in all of that?
I agree it's time for new, younger leadership.
Because they were both too old in the first place, and we do need a new generation of political leaders.
I look back and the world's different than 10 years ago. So I can't imagine the world that they were growing up in, that they think they know, that they've been separated from for so long, like a Trump or a Biden. And just the topics and all the issues are so much different, and they have to be handled so much differently because they're so used to a lens and a political philosophy that just kind of needs to change with the time.
So what's interesting to me about that is the idea of new generational leadership was so central to Nikki Haley's message, but it almost sounds like perhaps Biden's presence in the race has inoculated Donald Trump against that attack.
Yeah, Garrett, to me, what kind of the takeaway is like how little has actually changed given all the events. And this focus group, importantly, came not only after Harris is now the de facto nominee after Joe Biden's exit, but also after the Republican convention, after an assassination attempt, after that first debate. And what was so interesting was like, were your minds kind of changed going into this? Like, were you Biden voters and have you changed and now you're someone else? And really, people's voting preference really haven't changed all that much. And so that was kind of taking away the age situation. It's a good messaging for the campaigns and the candidates, but it doesn't necessarily seem to have changed voters' minds all that much, at least according to these focus groups.
Last question. Having covered the Trump campaign for so long, it doesn't seem like they think they need these voters. They don't seem to be actively pursuing them. Who do you think does need these kind of voters more in their coalition if they want to be the next president?
Yeah, Garrett, more of these voters are traditional Republican voters. So you would normally end up saying Trump probably needs them more than Harris does. But look, in our polarized times when the polls show a very close race, every voter segment does matter. But what also really stuck out to me was that these voters really like Nikki Haley. Like, I mean, they were effusive about her, loyal about her. And man, that was really striking.
Well, hey, Kamala Harris still needs to pick a vice presidential running mate, so maybe there's an opportunity.
They want
here.
Nikki Haley to be her pick. That was fascinating.
All right, Mark Murray, thank you for that. It's fascinating stuff. And up next, from the headlines to the sidelines, how the Trump campaign is looking to regain the spotlight after a wild week of developments and momentum for Vice President Harris and the Democrats. My interview with a senior advisor to the Trump campaign is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
She's the most radical person probably that we've had in office, let alone the office of the presidency. She was a horrible campaigner when she ran. You know, she ran against Biden. And I thought he was terrible, but she was terrible. She was horrible. And she was the meanest person up there.
Welcome back. That was former President Donald Trump hitting Vice President Kamala Harris this morning. On stage last night in Charlotte and on the airwaves this morning, the former president said he's done being nice on the campaign trail. Was he ever? After dealing with what he calls, quote, garbage from the other side. Joining me now is Trump campaign senior advisor Danielle Alvarez. And Danielle, thanks for coming on. I want to start by playing you something that J.D. Vance said at a fundraiser in his first appearance as the Republican vice presidential nominee. This was after the assassination attempt during RNC week. Let's listen.
I cannot believe an assassin tried to take down the president of the United States. I was mad about it. Was he mad and angry? He called for national unity. He called for calm. He showed leadership, my friends, that the media keeps on saying they want somebody to tone down the temperature. Well, Donald Trump got shot and he toned down the temperature. That's what a real leader does.
And then last night we heard Trump say he's not going to be nice anymore and call the other side a threat to democracy that will destroy our country. He called Harris a lunatic. This is 2 weeks later. Should we assume he is done turning down the temperature?
Well, I think that following the assassination attempt, it took a leader like President Trump to understand and meet the moment. He stood up. He let the crowd know that he was okay as they were waiting with bated breath. Many of your colleagues were there as well. But we are in a presidential race and the stakes are incredibly high. And Kamala Harris is dangerously liberal. So we need to call balls and strikes like we see them. It's very important to call her on her record. You know, she's the original border czar. She was a part of the Harris-Biden administration that has caused chaos on the world stage, record inflation. I mean, just disaster after disaster. And it is really important that we be honest about that record and say it clearly because it's what the American people will be deciding on.
A record is one thing. I think lunatic is another thing. I want to ask you about these different attacks that we've started to see from the former president and from members of his party. Both parties are really trying to define Kamala Harris. We just talked about that in our last segment. Has the Trump campaign decided kind of which road you want to go down? I have a hard time combining the messages. On the one hand, Trump calls her incompetent. On the other hand, he implies that she's the person behind the scenes pulling all the strings in the Biden White House. So which is it?
Both things can absolutely be true. She is incompetent in the policies that she has supported with Joe Biden. Let's remember she was the deciding vote on the $1.9 trillion spending package in the administration that rocketed us into inflation. So she is both incompetent and failed in her leadership, but she is absolutely making those decisions. She is a failed border czar. She was given that task by Joe Biden. She was in Houston today, 300 miles from the border, and has not gone to see the devastation and the mess that her failure has resulted in. With the fentanyl pouring in, with the migrant crime rising, I mean, that is squarely on the Harris-Biden administration and on Kamala Harris, who was the original border czar.
Since you brought up the border, I want to ask about the Trump campaign's plan for the border. It's sort of a signature issue for the former president, as you know. We saw signs last night in Charlotte that said, "Deport illegals now." Now, Donald Trump has said he'll institute the largest deportation effort in U.S. history, but he hasn't given a lot of details about how that will work. So I'm curious what else you can tell me about that plan. What'll it cost? Will he seek to deport every single undocumented immigrant in the United States, something like 11 million people?
It's a key factor in his platform. The president passed a historic platform that he wrote himself, Agenda 47 and the RNC platform, and it is one of the key points. It's broadly supported by every American, including Hispanic Americans. And the reality is that we cannot sustain the 10 million plus illegal border crossings of the Biden-Harris administration. It is a failure.
But
And
Danielle,
so
passing a platform is very different from passing a law. I mean, what I still haven't heard is anything about how this would actually work.
Well, as we know, President Trump has a record of success of accomplishing things when the Washington, D.C. elites say that it can't be accomplished. And so he has said that he will secure the border. He has said that he will deport illegal immigrants and those that have crossed under the Biden-Harris administration. And you can definitely take that to the bank. It is a priority of his in the administration. He's run on the border since 2015. It's an issue that is top of mind for American voters. In the focus groups and in the polling that we have seen, it is the number one or number two issue. And it trades with inflation and the economy. And so the president is going to take care of both of those, as his record in the White House has shown previously.
I don't dispute the salience of the issue, but it's not quite clear to me what I'm taking to the bank at this point, other than a concept. I want to move on, though. We've also talked about how your campaign wants to define the vice president, but I want to play a little bit of how she's trying to define herself as we get into this 100-day sprint here. Listen to this.
I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
So does she? What's the Trump campaign's response to that?
Kamala Harris is chaotic on crime at best. We know that she was very harsh for minor crimes, especially as it related to the Black community, went for the harshest sentences and imprisoned Black men. But then she was very soft on illegal immigrants. And we know that to be true with the Bologna family when she would not prosecute the MS-13 gang member who brutally murdered two members of the family. She never pursued charges and never went harshly against illegal immigrants. And it goes back to her being, again, chaotic on crime, soft on crime when she should not have been, and too harsh in other instances. And it goes back to being very weak on the border. This is someone who in 2020 campaigned on abolishing ICE, wanted to decriminalize border crossings. We know that the top issue for voters, one of the top two at least, she is very, very weak on.
A record on crime that was so inconsistent that Donald Trump wrote a check to her campaign for attorney general after that time as district attorney. Danielle, Alvarez, thank you for coming on with us. I appreciate you bringing the Trump campaign's perspective to our viewers.
Thank you for having me.
And after the break, hey, big spender, Republican and Trump-affiliated groups are now spending 24 times as much money on TV and radio ads as Democrats right now, with just over 100 days until Election Day. The message, the strategy, and the panel, it's all next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. With Vice President Harris's campaign really just getting off the ground, the Trump campaign finds itself in a rare position this cycle. They're dominating the television airwaves. Check this out. According to data from our NBC Politics team via Ad Impact, Republican groups have spent nearly $63 million on TV and radio ads for this week through the end of August. Compare that to just more than $2.5 million on the Democratic side. Now, of course, this data can and will change at any time, as Democratic groups are likely to start spending money on their new candidate. But in the race to define Vice President Harris, this ad battle could prove pivotal. Joining me now is the panel. Betsy Woodruff-Swan, national correspondent at Politico and an NBC News contributor. Faz Shakir, advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. And Sarah Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. So, Faz, you've run campaigns before. Talk to me about what's going on right now, this battle to define Kamala Harris. We've heard it from voters. We've heard it from the Trump campaign in a certain way. Nobody seems to know exactly what kind of commodity they're dealing with here.
Well, she's got the great opportunity to introduce herself to a lot of people who are wondering who she is and what are her values. And I think she's got to define what are the issues that are most salient and align with people's expectations and hopes for her. I think you could see her either as Obama 3.0, Garrett, where, you know, Obama built this huge, massive coalition of young people, one Indiana, one North Carolina, one Ohio, or you could see as Hillary 2.0, in which you had to fight uphill, lost Midwestern states that were absolutely critical. Depending on where you see that, I think you're thinking about, I see it a little bit closer to Hillary 2.0, in which you're having to fight uphill, that you're working from behind, and you're saying, I want to talk to working class voters who are going to decide this election, and I want to introduce myself to them with certain key messages that will make them feel persuaded about joining this ticket. And I hope that that's what the ad campaigns are going to be about.
Sarah, you heard the Trump campaign trying to define Kamala Harris. She's both too soft on crime and too hard on crime, depending on what the issue might be. They talk about the border. What do you make of kind of the scattershot approach that you've seen so far from them?
I think it's just that, a scatter, you know, they're all over the place. They need to focus on one issue and drive that and describe her that way. I think soft on crime is the best way. Suburban women, who I think are going to end up deciding this election, are really, they want to see something done with crime. Crime really concerns them.
And Betsy, we've seen something of a honeymoon period for Kamala Harris here, and we don't know how long that period may go. She's got to name a vice presidential running mate. She's going to have a convention at some point here. If you're the Harris campaign, how do you maintain this spotlight and kind of do to Donald Trump what Donald Trump did to his Republican primary rivals and just block out the sun?
It's challenging, and the fact that there's this current and certainly temporary but huge discrepancy in ad buys is obviously not doing her any favors. Now, that was built in, that was inevitable. As soon as Biden pulled out, there were going to be some major logistical challenges, and that's what we're seeing right now. But of course, paid media, these TV ads that become ubiquitous in swing states in the weeks before an election day, that stuff's helpful. At the same time, we saw it very much not help President Biden in the months before he dropped out, when his team just fired off the money fire hose on paid media and didn't have the polling changes to deliver on it.
Well, we know historically, big money spent in big races where people already know the candidates is less effective than money spent down ballot where you don't necessarily know these folks. Faz, what do you make of, we're hearing now Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, they're going to be out campaigning on Kamala Harris's behalf. Without Kamala Harris, this is very Trumpian in a way. Put your VP candidates out there, do the apprentice-style thing.
Totally.
Effective?
Yeah, because first of all, you need an army of people to help you get your message across anyways. So even absent a VP search, it's great to have people. I would expand that numbers even broader. Say, hey, Liz Cheney, hey, you know, business people like Mark Cuban, you're all in the mix. And urge them all to get out there and say, hey, here's why Kamala Harris is great. So I think there's fruitfulness to this. I would also say that on the frame of who she is, she's prosecutor and freedom. Those are the two things you're hearing right now, right? And I think you think about who complements that and who accentuates that as a VP pick. I don't know that I have a great name for you right now, but I do think that's a framework value. Think about who helps you do that.
Well, don't worry, we might have 2 more weeks to figure out.
Yeah, exactly.
Sarah, on that end, I mean, is this an opportunity here for Kamala Harris to define herself with a personnel choice, right? Personnel is politics. this will be a lens through which a lot of people look at her. I mean, you heard that Nikki Haley voter focus group. They love her to pick Nikki Haley.
Right.
Can she use the disaffected Republicans out there, not to be her VP pick, but to help start telling that story of who she wants to be in this race?
Absolutely. They're looking to her to do just that. And the suburban women, again, which is what Main Street focuses on with me, they love the governor of North Carolina because they think it puts North Carolina in play, but they really like the senator from Arizona. They like Mark Kelly. They like his name ID. They like the fact that he's an astronaut. They describe that as kind of sexy, that he's actually gone up. And I'm like, okay.
Hey,
and then the real thing that they are excited about, he has stood by his wife. When she was shot, he became her voice. He has taken care of her for over a decade. They really like that. So I would say between the two, probably Mark is their first choice.
What do those women think about the prospect of 2 women on the ticket?
No, which is surprising to me. We've done a lot of polling around this. No, they don't think 2 women on a ticket will win because, no offense, gentlemen, but they don't think the men would vote for a ticket with 2 women.
It's fascinating. The idea of electability being what your neighbor or your neighbor's husband wants,
Yes.
not what you actually think might be better. Betsy, we've spent a lot of time covering Donald Trump. We know that he sometimes gets uncomfortable when he's not in the spotlight, and that can be when he does some of the things that end up being most damaging to him. What do you think about the way his campaign will have to try to manage what could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, where he is not the top story?
It's going to be really tough and uncomfortable for them. And you know that every time he appears in an unscripted setting, that his staffers are just going to be holding their breaths. Trump is really good at saying things that cause significant electoral harm for him almost immediately. And we have to remember, too, 2016 was a very strange election. And the idea that Republicans can just replicate what happened that year 8 years later, well, there's a lot of polling that Trump supporters love to point to as evidence that the wind is at their backs. When we look at the way voters have actually behaved since 2016, it indicates lots and lots and lots of flashing red lights for Trump's team. And their effort to pivot to the middle could very much be undermined by the president's efforts, of course, the former president's efforts to get himself back in the news and try to regain the spotlight. It's also this very strange irony of the fact that Trump's criminal cases have pretty much all dissolved, at least for the time being. The way that, from Trump's view, that's eliminated the biggest microphone that he actually ever had.
Well, and that's a great point. Though I quibble with how much he's actually tried to pivot to the middle. Faz, I've been developing this theory that a week ago Thursday, basically in the middle of that speech might have been peak Trump.
Yes.
That might have been the high point for his campaign. With the criminal cases gone, how does he regain control of the narrative, the spotlight? Does he just have to hang on for another debate?
Well,
is that
he's also struggling with just a framework of who Kamala Harris is. It's like you saw that last night. He's far left, laughing, all vicious, mean. I've heard all kinds of things about her. He doesn't know how to talk about his opponent. When he doesn't have a reason or a way to talk about his opponent, he doesn't have a campaign. You're getting out there to tell people what are the choices, and he can't fundamentally do it right now. And so you're going to see what I sensed from that speech last night was more anger, like frustration. How dare they flip the script on me? I don't know what I'm doing. No, yeah, it's not fair, right? Exactly. And you're looking in the past, you're looking at your grievances, you're looking at process, you're not looking at substance and future.
So I think you're going to have the last word here, but we're talking about your polling here. I'm curious what you make of the age issue flipping. That was the other big part of this, that now all of a sudden Donald Trump's the old guy candidate. Those Nikki Haley voters didn't seem particularly troubled by that. Is age still a salient issue in this race without Joe Biden in it?
It is not. It's gone away because most people saw, believe it or not, Joe Biden as the old man, not necessarily Trump. So the age thing has really calmed down. It's
not an effective tool for Democrats to pursue. All right, Betsy, what do they replace it with?
It's tricky. Obviously, the biggest argument from Harris is that Trump is a felon and a dangerous person. They, of course, would love to be able to talk about the age issue, but it's uncomfortable for them. So I would expect felon to be either top 1 or top 2 words you'll be hearing for the next few months.
All right, we'll see it happen. Betsy, Faz, Sarah, thank you all for coming in and for your expertise. And still to come, I'll talk to the parents of Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who was taken hostage by Hamas 293 days ago now, about their joint meeting with President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu and the push to bring their son and the other hostages home. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. And as we mentioned, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu met today with the families of American hostages being held by Hamas. According to the White House, 8 Americans are believed to still be in Gaza, 5 of whom are believed to still be alive. including Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who was abducted from the Nova Music Festival by Hamas on October 7th and has been held hostage for 293 days now. His parents, Rachel Goldberg-Polin and John Polin, participated in that meeting at the White House, which just wrapped up a few minutes ago. They've been gracious enough to join me now. So please take us inside the room a little bit. How did that White House meeting go, and what did President Biden and the Prime Minister have to say?
So President Biden kicked off the meeting by talking about some of the personal experiences he's had in his life with challenge, with loss, and the urgency of putting us out of our ambiguous trauma, the uncertainty of what's going on with our loved ones, and the importance of bringing them home now. Prime Minister Netanyahu then basically continued that theme and assured us that he's doing everything he can to make it happen. And then the room opened for conversation. We all got to say what we wanted to say. We all impressed upon the leaders our gratitude for what they've done so far and our push for them to not stop until we get all of our loved ones out. And not only to get our loved ones out, which of course was the focus of the meeting, but the importance of calming the region. Everybody in the region benefits from a hostage deal that will be part of a ceasefire and that will enable the whole region to figure out how to move forward in a more peaceful way.
Did you get a substantive update on the status of those ceasefire talks? Administration officials have told us that there's been a framework agreed to, but we've heard nothing about implementation.
Well, we also were not privy to details. These are very sensitive negotiations and conversations that are going on. So, and some things that were shared with us were things that we wouldn't necessarily think are appropriate to share forward, but we're not privy to those kind of details.
Well, then let me ask it this way. Are you more confident leaving the meeting than you were going into it that a ceasefire could be near?
I want to say I'm more confident for a few reasons. I'm more confident based on the urgency that we heard in the room, the cries that we heard in the room, and the understanding of the urgency of this moment. In addition, what we also now know to be true, not necessarily from the meeting in the room, but what we know in the last day or two to be true is global pressure is increasing on all sides in a way that's more likely to lead to a productive end of this situation. And domestically in Israel, we feel like the leadership across the military and intelligence communities feel like they have gotten the negotiations to the point where they think the time is ripe. And we've heard from the parties that are representing Hamas that they believe that now the time is ripe for the Hamas side as well. So all conditions seem to be coming together. But of course, as we have said, we're not going to count our chickens or our hostages until they are home in our arms with us hugging them.
Understandable. You were also in that meeting that Netanyahu held with hostage families earlier this week. We have some reporting that basically whenever the American families pushed the prime minister on a hostage deal, his aides would call on his guests from Israel who would basically back up his insistence that the military still needs to go after Hamas. I'm curious, after this meeting, if you feel like Netanyahu is really listening to what you and the other American families have been telling him, if he's sort of really engaged with the urgency of what you're pushing for.
It certainly was what we were hearing. And I do think after the last several days here in the United States that Prime Minister Netanyahu is understanding there is a consensus, certainly from the United States and other parties as well, that now is the time. And as John said, we're hearing about the suffering not just of the 120 hostage families, but also the hundreds of thousands of Gazan civilians who are suffering horribly. Our entire region has a surplus of pain and agony, and it is quite clear to every single party involved in these negotiations that the time has come for this to end.
I want to add that what's happened this week in Washington is that President Biden, who made the bold announcement that he is going to step down, is clearly so fully committed to bringing this process over the finish line now, and he could focus on it even more than he already has been. And the two candidates for president, Vice President Harris and President Donald Trump, all three of them have been unequivocally clear this week that this must end. So if there's any party at the negotiating table who has some political calculus that there's benefit in waiting, I believe that message this week is there isn't. The deal must happen now.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because there have been suggestions that Netanyahu is essentially trying to hold out until our elections are over in November in the hopes that he could get a better deal from Donald Trump if he wins. Do you think there are politics in this moment that are contributing to whether or not there's a deal?
We've actually heard twice now President Trump has issued statements saying now is the time to get this done. This needs to be over. He has been unequivocal about that. And so I think that really shuts down that argument.
What did you make of the protests that we saw all around D.C. yesterday during Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech and afterwards? How do you kind of balance, obviously, the speech that you were trying to give, the message that you're trying to put out there with what you're seeing in terms of these large-scale protests around the city here yesterday, but around the country from time to time?
Well, part of being in a democracy is that we do have the right to express what we think. And I actually think being in a true, vibrant democracy, people are allowed to say what they feel and how they understand a situation. I would say that this is a very complicated, complex, layered conflict, and that not everyone is completely aware of the nuances involved. I think there are many of these protesters who don't even realize that of the hostages being held, they represent 24 different nations. They are Muslim, they are Jewish, they are Christian, they are Buddhist, they are Hindus. We have become friendly with one of the Muslim Arab families whose loved ones are being held captive along with Hersh. And one of the family members said, why is no one advocating for our family member? There are two of them. Why is no one advocating for our Muslim Arab hostages? We've heard from some of the Thai Buddhist families. Why is no one advocating for their loved ones? There are Black Christian Africans being held hostage. You don't hear those protest voices for those people. And I think that it's simply that they are not aware that this is not a monolithic group of people being held.
I want to add even more to that.
Well, John, I'm sorry. I have to cut you off because we have completely run out of time. But I thank you so much for coming on and being willing to share your story and your family's story with us. And I wish you good luck in the advocacy that you are doing. It's so important. With that, I have to let you go, though. I am back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Yasmin Vesuvian in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.